After Putin's Munich Security Conference speech in 2007, Moscow's intent to challenge the West became clearer. A question arose almost immediately: how far the country as a whole or its leader was at fault, whether the world had a Russia problem or a Putin problem. But since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, analysts have continued to debate the attitudes of ordinary Russians towards the war. Do a majority support the crimes and atrocities committed by the country's armed forces? And if not, why do they give every appearance of doing so and acquiesce to be mobilized and to take part in these criminal acts? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy the incredible guests that take part in these interviews. Please do also like, subscribe, share, and of course, comment on the material, because that will help other people to discover the fantastic guests that we feature. Also, please do check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It's more important than ever before that we help Ukraine to remain resilient and to resist Russian aggression. Today I'm speaking to Keir Giles, who has spent his career watching, studying and explaining Russia. His work has appeared in a wide range of academic and military publications across Europe and in North America, and he's a regular contributor and commentator on Russian affairs for international print and broadcast media. He's a senior consulting fellow at the UK's Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and also works with the Conflict Studies Research Centre, a group of deep subject matter experts on Eurasia security, formerly attached to the British Ministry of Defence. And for those of you who pay attention to the channel, the hardcore of you, you will know that this is the third time I've had the honour and privilege to be able to speak to Keir on the channel. Let's start with a topic that links internal politics with foreign policy. Of course, we still hear a lot of Russian propaganda about how NATO is to blame for everything we're seeing, but it seems increasingly the case that it is regime survival, succession, and transition that is actually having a very heavy influence on Russia's behavior abroad, including its full-scale war on Ukraine. Would you agree with this, Keir?
Well, I'm not so sure about that, Jonathan. And first of all, thanks very much for welcoming me back. As you say, it's the third time, but it turns out there's actually quite a lot to talk about. So yes, very happy to be back here again. And I was particularly pleased when you introduced this segment with the comment about Putin's Munich speech in 2007 by saying that it made Russia's intent to challenge the West clearer. Some people say clear, but of course, to those of us who were in the business at the time, the biggest surprise was that everybody was surprised that Putin had finally stated how he felt about the way things were going in the world and what he suggested Russia would actually be doing about it in the long term. So all of this is a process. It's not a sudden event often. It's a trend that you see developing over time. And I think the same is true of both of the two things that you introduced there with the questions. Is it true, for instance, that what Russia is saying about the war on Ukraine is still based on the idea that this is all NATO to blame, that it is NATO's acceptance of new member states in Eastern Europe, that it's the aggressive West that is pushing Russia to do it? You're quite right that you do still hear that storyline, but you don't hear it quite so much from Russia anymore. Instead, it is Russia's propagandists, Russia's useful idiots in the West who haven't quite caught up with the fact that Russia has largely abandoned that pretense. And if you listen to President Putin or his closest acolytes, the people are explaining why the war happened and what Russia wants to achieve in it. They've stepped away from saying that it is anything other than a colonial war of reconquest. So it's only those people that really haven't kept up with what Russia itself is saying. They're still pushing this line that it is all NATO to blame. And there's a parallel there also with the second part of your question about, is this all about regime survival? There have been, over the years, lots of Western analysts who have pointed to a supposed connection between Putin staying in power and the need for foreign adventures. And they can point to some correlation. They say that if you track Putin's popularity ratings and map them to foreign interventions, then you can see that there's some kind of alignment. But again, this isn't actually necessarily all pinned to Putin trying to ensure that he has another term in power. He didn't need to start another war, whether in 2014 or in 2022, for that reason, because his position was already assured. Instead, it's external factors that actually make the difference. In 2014, there was the crisis, and which presented an opportunity, and Russia had already been emboldened by the results of what it had seen in Syria in 2013, pushing back Western influence, and in Georgia in 2008, that you could mount military operations, and the downside, the strategic consequences, would be entirely positive and no real cost to Russia. So they took the opportunity. And then in 2022, slightly different set of circumstances. This was the moment for which Russia had been preparing for decades, overhauling its military, putting itself back into a position where it could confront a military adversary in a planned war. And it thought easily achieve the aims that it wanted to. Plus, of course, the confidence that the West would not respond, once again, bolstered by this procession of Western leaders to Moscow at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, who were saying everything except anything that would deter Putin from moving in. So that combination of faith in their own capabilities and confidence that there would not be a downside was what pushed for that decision to invade Ukraine, to escalate the war by a full-scale invasion and a full-scale war actually to be taken in February 2022. So in neither of those cases, nor often it seems in any of the others, is it a matter of ensuring regime survival, because there are other factors that make sure that nothing is actually going to challenge Putin. Primarily, of course, the fact that in parallel with preparation for external aggression, there have also been all of the preparations to make sure that Putin and those around him are secure, that there is not going to be a challenge. The elimination of the opposition, which, let's not forget, in the middle of 2021, when Russia suddenly changed gear, when it suddenly moved to a totally new strategic approach and started to be ready to move fast and break things, that wasn't only externally, it was also the crackdown internally, moving from controlling the opposition domestically to actually trying to eliminate it altogether. And that too is a trend. It's something that has progressed. It's something that's moved on through for example, the death of Alexei Navalny, who may have come back in 2020 into a Russia where he thought he might have survived, but Russia changed around him again through this strategic change of gear and this change of attitude, both to the consequences of actions and to the domestic opposition. So, Jonathan, I'm very sorry. That is an extremely long-winded way of saying, no, I'm not quite sure I agree with you.
No, I think, and it's great to be challenged in that way. And it's interesting you mentioned 2021 because whereas I wasn't watching this every day, whereas I wasn't, not a professional analyst, but I was watching quite a bit of Russian output at that point, Dogged and other materials. And it was absolutely clear, as you say, through 2021, that something significantly was changing behind the scenes. They were really ratcheting up the tensions. Navalny himself was also, maybe through his own agenda or through anticipating this, he was ratcheting the states up as well, wasn't he? From actually attacking, Putin's associates to actually attacking Putin's directly, and not just his regime, attacking his money and his status and his wealth in the video he made about the palace at Gilin. So you see this ratcheting up, perhaps on both sides in some ways.
Well, yes, the Navalny trajectory, of course, was a longer one, and all of his escalation against Putin, as opposed to the other way around, actually took place quite a lot earlier, which, after all, is probably why they tried to kill him in the first place. But then he went back for more and eventually got what Russia had promised him all along. But it is really interesting to think about what we could and could not see from outside the country in that second half of 2021, because, as you say, it was obvious that something had changed. I think back to November, December 2021, beginning of very start of 2022, when the conversations that we were having with government agencies in various parts of the world who were much better informed than us about what Russia was actually planning, knew that something was going to happen. But of course, we didn't know that that something was actually going to be a full-scale invasion in the way that it panned out at the end of February 2022. This is what the intelligence communities in the US and the UK were saying was going to happen. But of course, so for some of the most willing and receptive audiences for that information, like the Russia watching community, it still seemed somehow incredible. And that speaks to a disconnect, if you like, so a way in which that story was not put across sufficiently convincingly or with sufficient backing material to actually bring people along with it. There were some people who discounted the possibility of a Russian invasion because it was unthinkable. There were others who discounted the possibility of a Russian invasion because it was obviously going to be a disaster. And in that category tended to be anybody that had paid any attention to Ukraine since 2014. They knew that this would be a horrific quagmire that Russia would be wading into, and assumed that Russia must be able to see this too. And then for that reason, these intelligence warnings of Russia's imminent invasion they seemed a little bit less plausible. So it really wasn't until in my personal case, I can track this through the things that I was writing through that period and into January, February 2022. It really wasn't until about mid-January that all of the weight of evidence that this was about to happen became incontrovertible. And I think for me, the final straw was Putin's yacht being pulled out of dry dock in Hamburg and brought back to Russia to be safe from sanctions. Plainly, something was about to happen.
That's a very clear. The lights are going off on the dashboard, aren't they, at that point? And here's another point, because we've talked a little bit about, I would say, institutional bias or bias of experts, especially those with a sort of Moscow lens. I detect some of that in some experts even now. I mean, naming no names, and the reluctance to label Russia as an imperialistic power with imperialist ambitions. But from 2014 onwards, if you're paying attention to the internal Russian media, there is an increasing prevalence of genocidal narratives. And of course, they reach a crescendo in 2022, but they didn't start in 2022. Again, that kind of rhetoric must be pre-approved, planned. We know this stuff doesn't happen by accident in Russian propaganda. How difficult, though, is it for experts who are in some ways, Russophiles, even if they're critical, to embrace the idea that the thing they've really dedicated their life to has become, in effect, potentially a genocidal monster? And even now, that seems to be difficult for some people to really face that.
Well, I think there are as many different answers to that question as there are as many different Russia experts, because anybody that has difficulty confronting the reality of what has happened in Russia and what this country is, what this society is, will have their own particular reasons for doing so. Whether it is the fact that they have romantic notions of Russia, whether it is that they have a vested interest in not criticizing Russia, which applies to quite a few of our respected friends and colleagues, whether it is for some other reason. In some cases, of course, if they have staked their academic reputation on a particular view of the world, a particular construct for why countries do something or why Russia does something, then, of course, if they admit that they are wrong, it brings their career tumbling down. So they have to stick with that one horse, even when it becomes increasingly clear that it is utterly unrelated to reality. So many different reasons why different people in different professions, not just academics and analysts, still cling to this idea of Russia that should have been left long behind. It's similar to what we were talking about right at the very beginning, when the people who make excuses for Russia are continuing to make the excuses that Russia has already abandoned because they've placed their bets on them. They've staked their reputations on them, so they can't really go back on them now.
And that comes back to, I think, your thesis, and the really interesting point you make in a book like Moscow Rules is not so much to see Russia through what we want it to be or what we think it is, but to understand its motivations and behaviors and adapt our behavior and strategy accordingly. At this point, are we still not adopting a firm deterrent strategy? Let's take the death of Alexei Navalny. It's been tackled from many different angles. One of those angles, however, could be that he died because we did not define our red lines sufficiently. We didn't articulate what the cost of his death in Putin's custody would be. And he's now dead, and it seems, at least I can't see any really clear red lines or punishment really being enacted following his demise.
Let me just take that first part of your question first, if I may. When you're talking about the mental approach that you take to understanding Russia, and yes, I think one of the biggest problems that we still have, and one of the things I try to approach in Moscow Rules and try to explain why it is such a block to understanding what Russia might do, is thinking of Russia as a Western European country, thinking of Russia as a country that operates in the same way as the democracies that we're familiar with, and has institutions and societies that have evolved past feudalism, that has leaders who are interested in the fortunes of their country as much as they are in their own personal fortunes. All of the things that define statehood in Europe, for example, in North America to some extent, have to be abandoned in order to understand how Russia operates. And some people have found that extremely hard to abandon, to recognize that this is a threat that is from outside Europe and also from outside our century, that displays all of these features of societies that have not evolved in the last few hundred years. So think just of the most simple example, Yevgeny Prigozhin taking his mercenary army out of the front line and marching on the capital with demands. It's something that's perfectly normal for Europe of the 1500s. And that's just one of the features of Russian society and of Russian individual behavior that is so shocking to us. But you need to step away from preconceptions to understand that this is Russian normality, and that is the reason why it needs to be held back in Ukraine so it does not come any further into Europe. But on that second part of your question, the red lines, the threats over what would happen to Navalny, there were the usual dire threats. It was Joe Biden talking about catastrophic consequences, for instance, if Navalny were to die in prison. The trouble is we hear that language so often, and it's just not followed through on. Russia was threatened with dire consequences in late 2021 if it went ahead and invaded Ukraine. But at the same time, the worst options, as in the worst options for Russia, the things which actually would have caused Russia to stop and think and possibly reconsider its plans, were taken off the table. There was an explicit statement that there would be no military opposition to Russia intervening in Ukraine. Now, regardless of whether that was a realistic option or not, it's a mistake that is repeated over and over again, taking off the table the thing that would actually influence Russia's risk-benefit calculus. So in this context, where Russia had not only made this strategic change of gear that we talked about, where it was no longer caring about its reputation or its relationships with the West at all, and furthermore had also decided that it was going to crack down and eliminate internal opposition. And that relief is reinforced by the fact that the West is so appallingly bad at following through on its threats. There was really no reason for Putin or for whoever in the chain of command actually took this decision to hold back from going ahead with eliminating Navalny.
And just a short sort of question that follows on from that, which again is this imposition of a Western set of expectations. Many expectations were heaped upon Navalny and his team, which Ukrainians would point out are perhaps not perhaps realistic, and then they'd use far I would say stronger terms than that to critique those. And it does seem that we are imposing a Western set of political behaviors, even and psychology, onto Russia. We expect there to be popular resistance. We expect people to resist mobilization. We expect people to organize and there to be some kind of tipping point where the regime just goes kind of too far. But I think in one of the early videos we did on the channel was just to articulate the simple phrase, Putin will not be stopped until he is stopped, because there is no internal mechanism, either institutionally or in any kind of popular mass organization, that will actually stop him within the country itself.
Yeah, quite. I mean, yes, another of the assumptions that people make when they're projecting onto Russia, which actually don't have any bearing on the country at all, that there must be people within the country that think that what is going on is so terrible. First of all, it's terrible in the first place, and secondly, so bad that they must actually do something about it, which is very manifestly not the case, because Russia has done an exceptionally good job of making sure that there is not that organized political opposition, and that people do know that if they protest in a way which actually challenges the central regime, then the consequences will be deeply unpleasant. But in that context, of course, when you look at Russia from the outside, then anybody that stands against Putin, anybody that criticizes Putin, risks being embraced by the West as plainly the kind of politician that we would like to have in place of Putin. But of course, the two don't map together at all. There are some deeply unpleasant individuals that have criticized Putin who we absolutely would not want to see in power in the Kremlin. And again, it's that divorcing of expectations from assumptions about how things work in the rest of the world is so absolutely critical to understanding what's happening in Russia itself and what may happen. Navalny himself, obviously a hugely controversial figure, not least because of things he said at earlier stages in his career, which embodied some of the worst elements of that Russian imperialism and chauvinism, and from which he did walk away very successfully, but his movement as a whole doesn't seem to have entirely renounced. And then, of course, the response after his death, the way in which the movement itself has carried on and has been critical of the war, but doesn't seem to think that the genocide of Ukrainians is actually a terrible thing in itself. So this is why people looking at it critically from outside the country are so concerned about the way all Western hopes were pinned on this one element of the Russian opposition, largely ignoring a lot of the other very motivated individuals that have been standing against Putin, because they saw that it embodied in itself some of the problems of Russianness, which Putin is an example of rather than an inspiration for.
And let's pose the big question, really. The sort of, I would say, the focus of this conversation is going to be that Ukraine has a clear sense of victory. And if you speak to most Ukrainians, they will articulate it and they will say the same things. A recovery of legal territories, including Crimea and Donbass, a return of their people, and so on. And of course, some kind of reparation for crimes. So a clear sense of victory, which we can actually understand, I think, in our Western framework. Russians, I expect, do not have that same sense. So what's your view here? Are victory and defeat essentially the same things to most Russians who are participating in the invasion, in the sense of the outcomes for their individually? There is no real difference between a state of victory and a state of defeat.
I think there may well be, because there is such a clear distinction in Russia's aims between what constitutes success and what would constitute failure. And success has been very clearly defined by Russia. It is the elimination of Ukraine, or at least half of Ukraine as an acceptable minimum, as an independent state, and its reabsorption into Russia. If that doesn't happen, then Russia has plainly not succeeded. And while there may not be any direct impact on the lives of Russians across the country, other than their standard of living getting even worse, and maybe one or two people from their community coming home in body bags, it is still a major reverse to Russia's ambitions if it does not pull this off. And of course, it's that reverse to Russia's ambitions that we have all been saying for so long is absolutely essential to start any kind of process of real change within Russia, because this is an imperial power, a former imperial power, which will not understand the word former until it is actually checked and held back and prevented from realizing its imperial ambition. On the other side, of course, on the Ukrainian side, you have a completely incompatible set of basic criteria for what constitutes not just victory, but survival. And if you think back to October 2022 and this 10-point plan for peace that was put forward by Zelensky, a list of criteria for what would constitute an acceptable outcome to the war for Ukraine. Only two of those points were actually about evicting the Russian invaders and upholding the UN Charter. All of the rest of it was much longer term thinking. It was providing for Ukraine's security by making sure that Russia was not in a position to do it again. And that is the absolutely crucial long-term element of Eastern European security. It's understood very well in the frontline states that what is required as an outcome for this war, in order to remove the only hard security threat on the European continent, is a defeat for Russia, which is sufficiently convincing that Russia realizes it's a bad idea to invade its neighbors. And that's why it's so absolutely vital that support goes to Ukraine. And that's the reason why the frontline states have been among the foremost in assisting Ukraine and donating whatever military capability they could to try to bring forward that reverse for Russia.
And this is perhaps where there is a major disconnect, which I would suggest goes back even to the first days of the war, full-scale war, and the response of Berlin and Washington in particular. I'm not sure you get this sense as well, but I'm not sure that the idea of retaking Donbass and especially Crimea, which would be pivotal to a perception of a Russian defeat, I'm not sure whether those are actually things that either Berlin or Washington have signed up to. And actually quite the reverse. Their supply of weapons in the sort of drip feed manner can be explained by just inertia, bureaucracy, etc. They could also be explained by these countries not wanting to see a full defeat of Russia, not wanting to see a collapse of its army and a calamitous retreat from the territory of Ukraine. They may be supplying to create some kind of imagined balance or status quo, which is immensely destructive, of course, to both armies, as we've seen.
Yes, I think it's important to be careful when talking about the level of aid and military assistance and also economic and humanitarian assistance that's gone to Ukraine, because it is too easy to write it all off as drip feeding, which overlooks the massive amounts of support that have actually gone in. What's been drip fed are the advanced capabilities that would actually really upset Russia. And that comes to the root of your question, because where Berlin and Washington have been so reticent, it is because they have fully internalized this Russian fairy tale about how, if Donbass and Crimea were to be retaken and liberated from this savage military occupation, this would constitute a threat to Russia that would be so severe that they would start flinging around nuclear weapons. That's something which has really taken deep root in both of those capitals, and it's a major break on supplying Ukraine with the capabilities that would actually facilitate that and bring it forward. It is not something that we give a great deal of credibility to. And beyond Washington and Berlin, there are not many European capitals that actually subscribed to this idea, because it is, and we've talked about this before in one of our previous chats, it is a product of this decades-long program of inculcating fear of Russian nuclear weapons and changing the whole term of the nuclear deterrence debate, which has been spectacularly successful in the United States and in Germany, and far less so, and this is very telling, far less so in those countries that you might think would be directly affected, namely the ones closest to Russia and the ones that know Russia best.
And there are a couple of prongs to this, aren't there? And I'd be interested to see whether you think this is a key part of Russia's projection of propagandistic narratives, maybe even active measures, disinformation, and so on, is to suggest that their willingness to use nuclear weapons is far looser than we thought. And there was a recent report that came out about I think their sort of criteria by which they'd use the weapons. And that seemed to be quite a coercive piece of material that came out. But also, we've seen a lot of sort of narratives come out, and we hear this repeated a lot, unfortunately, which is, well, Putin's bad, but the next guy is going to be worse. Or even this debate about whether Putin is rational or not. It seems to me that this is a very good way to control your enemy by suggesting that, one, better the devil you know, and by the way, even then, he's nuts, so you don't know what he's going to do. Whereas it seems to me, within his own framework, within a frame of reference, he's probably fairly rational, even though it's a very different frame of reference from our one.
You're right. There are lots of mutually supporting narratives that go towards this idea that Russia is on a nuclear hair trigger. Some of them might seem a little bit distant to actual use of nuclear weapons. And let's not forget the armed forces, the people who actually own these and would be responsible for firing, are the people within Russia who aren't using this loose talk about nuclear weapons. But yes, there's the drip feed of stories into Western media suggesting that the nuclear danger is imminent. And that's something which Russian propagandists, the Russian so-called foreign ministry spokespeople, have been actually very explicit about wanting to do. There was a wonderful article in Russia in Global Affairs when the nuclear fear seemed to be wearing off, called Верните страх by Dmitry Trenin. It was called Bring Back Fear. And this is something which is a very overt and explicit program. The Financial Times report that you're referring to, talking about scenarios for Russia using nuclear weapons, was a strange piece because it was very much in that mold of an information release, a DIT, which actually created this impression that Russia was on a lower nuclear threshold than previously suspected. In fact, it was described as such in the FT by responsible journalists who know Russia and you would have thought would know better. But everybody that is familiar with Russian nuclear doctrine and Russian deterrence theory, and there is a community of experts that understand this, looked at it and said, this is nothing of the kind. This just confirms everything that we already thought. And by the way, it's actually about China, which has nothing to do with Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. So the drip feed of those news reports continues, even though they ought to have been discredited. Other things that contribute to this impression, the famous Putin and the cornered rat story, which continues to do the rounds from his autobiography in the basement of his St. Petersburg apartment block, where he backs a rat into a corner and the rat lashes out. And this is taken as a parable to say that if Putin himself is backed into a corner, he'll be flinging away nukes. Everybody that subscribes to that interpretation of the story hasn't actually read the story itself, because it's Putin that runs away in the end, which is a lesson that we should be taking from that whole story, rather than thinking that he's the rat that's going to lash out. Similarly, activities in the physical domain. This whole over the course of years, the brinkmanship and the unprofessional airmanship and seamanship was displayed around Russia's periphery, with Russian aircraft and warships coming into dangerous proximity with NATO flights or NATO warships, all designed to create an impression that there was a risk of miscalculation, which was a trigger word, which would lead to uncontrollable escalation, which would inevitably lead to nuclear exchanges. The idea being to try to create a zone within which Russia had freedom of movement and impunity, by causing politicians to pull back and to say, no, it is too dangerous for us to challenge Russia, therefore we should let Russia do what it wants.
And that one worked remarkably well and continues to do so, unfortunately. And if we turn to that story, because clearly running away from the rat is not the version that Putin wanted you to take away from that story, but that leads to I think, a very interesting conclusion. I was discussing this, I think, 1 or 2 weeks ago, and then by a curious irony, this story about the terrorist threats within Russia came up. And the idea I put forward is that a catastrophic defeat in Ukraine would not necessarily result in him flinging nukes around, but what it would probably result in is a kind of red terror, a tightening of the screws, and him brutalizing his own people to make it quite clear that they shouldn't react to that disaster. In many ways, harking back to supposedly his original, I was about to say election, but appointment to the position, and the apartment bombings, which then in some ways solidified his rule. And certainly those who weren't clued up to the messages would see it as an external threat, and turn to him to protect them. And those who understand what's going on realize what kind of a vicious character he is and what he's prepared to do. Isn't it much more likely that we would see the return of terror acts, manipulation of the internal population in the event of a catastrophic defeat in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, agreed with you absolutely that defeat in Ukraine in itself is not something that is going to challenge Russia sufficiently that it is in the kind of position where releasing nuclear weapons would make things better, not worse. However, let's be careful with the word catastrophic, because if there was the amount of damage done to Russia's armed forces, to its conventional capability, that left it feeling genuinely threatened and completely vulnerable, then you start to stray into that territory. The point is, though, that whatever happens in Ukraine is unlikely to do that, because we've seen the evisceration of Russia's land forces and their reconstitution, which is ongoing. We've seen the Navy hammered in the Black Sea, but largely untouched elsewhere. The Air Force suffering losses, but generally more or less intact. We're nowhere near the kind of position that is described in those doctrinal documents. And there's no reason to think that that Putin or those around him would think that the loss of Ukraine, which is survivable, is worth trading for the risk of nuclear exchanges, which would be not survivable. It just doesn't make any logical sense. And logical sense, let's be very clear, even in that very distinctive framework of Russian logic and rationality.
And does
But in
that
terms of
include Crimea? I mean, would Crimea be included in that logic in your view as
absolutely,
well? Yeah.
yes, of course, absolutely not.
And that's interesting because what we see in the sinking of the corvette Sergei Kotov, which was a relatively new ship, I think 2021, and it's very much designed to actually ward off both missile but also drone attacks on the Kerch Bridge and retain control over that. The sinking of that suggests that Russia does not have impunity anywhere in the Black Sea. It also suggests that this could be laddering up to a strategy by Ukraine to erode the protections against the Kerch Bridge and perhaps a precursor to some kind of siege of Crimea or the next phase of the war. Physically retaking it, I'm told, by land is potentially not realistic at this point without significant change in the supply of weapons and you say advanced capabilities to Ukraine. But a siege potentially is on the cards. Do you think this is strategic or opportunistic, what Ukraine is doing at the moment?
Well, let's not rule out the possibility that actually is both. Opportunities to sink Russian warships does deliver strategic advantage. And we've seen that in Ukraine reopening the western part of the Black Sea, reopening it to trade routes, breaking that stranglehold that Russia previously had on Ukraine's ability to trade internationally by blocking shipping. And the fact that the western Black Sea has been effectively cleared of the Russian Navy is a major strategic success for Ukraine. So yes, it would be possible for them to continue that pressure. Russia has pulled back to its own coastline, which incidentally, of course, is an option that it had for doing all of those years when the Black Sea Fleet was based in Sevastopol. Russia could perfectly well have brought that Black Sea Fleet down back to its own sovereign territory. And the fact that it's now being more or less forced to by an active war is a self-inflicted injury for Russia. But yes, the preparations for some kind of operation against Crimea seem to have been ongoing for some time. We've seen the grinding down of air defenses. We've seen the attacks on shipping. We've seen the attacks specifically on the vessels that have been used as an augmentation to the Kerch Bridge for actually bringing supplies into Crimea. All of these seem to be chipping away at the umbilical cords between Russia and Crimea itself, so that what is left is the land bridge. And yes, there have been a lot of people speculating that the most effective strategy for Ukraine would be to increase that isolation so that effectively Crimea becomes untenable rather than attempt any kind of offensive against it.
And of course, it would also have lost its strategic value at that point because you're no longer able to project power either by air or sea. So it becomes a little bit of a white elephant, as it were.
That's exactly right. Crimea, simply by virtue of where it is a kind of bookend for Russia's western flank. You've got Kaliningrad as an outpost on the Baltic Sea, Crimea as an outpost, was an outpost previously on the Black Sea, but it could do precisely that. It could project power over an enormous region, and that function for Crimea has been already largely eroded.
Let's turn to another move which has been widely interpreted, in fact, labeled as a mistake by some and by Ukrainians. A lot of them that I've spoken to have labeled it as, this is internal politics, I don't like this, etc. And it's the move of General Zaluzhny to become the representative of Ukraine, the ambassador of Ukraine in London. There doesn't seem to be too much speculation about whether this is quite a smart strategic move. I suspect that it might be, or it might be hedging bets in the event of a fully isolationist US or even a fully obstructive US being run by Donald Trump. Then it's possible that the sort of Nordic, Baltic, UK sort of Northern Alliance might be the actual center point of resistance to or coordination of resistance amongst the allies. In support of Ukraine. So could this be quite a strategic move by putting a trusted lieutenant in charge rather than us or many of the media actually interpreting the relationship between Zaluzhny and Zelensky as one of fractiousness, etc., which never quite seemed to sort of gel when I read it.
Yes, there's been an awful lot of speculation about that relationship, and you can't help getting the impression that after Zelensky said for so long that he was not intending to replace Zaluzhny, he might eventually have been forced into doing so by the weight of speculation and simply Zaluzhny's position becoming untenable as a result of it. But For in terms of where Zelensky could go, well, yes, of course, he can capitalize on that strong relationship that was set up in the early stages of the war with the UK. And yes, of course, it's going to be absolutely vital to hold together coalitions within Europe against the possibility of the United States becoming even more detached, which becomes not a possibility but a probability in the event of a Trump victory in November. I wonder, though, if we should still be looking at the UK as the focal point of that coalition of the least unwilling to support Ukraine, because the UK was the leader. It was the country which dragged everybody else kicking and screaming behind it in the very early stages of the full-scale invasion, and indeed before it, overcoming the objections of other countries to provide weaponry to Ukraine, to provide support, to shame other countries into giving capabilities by, for example, being the first with cruise missiles, main battle tanks, etc., etc. But that leadership role has faded badly most recently, of course, because the UK is not doing what it is urging other countries to do in terms of boosting their own defense budgets in order to protect themselves. The most recent news and information that we have about what the UK is planning to spend on its own defense is deeply, deeply depressing when you compare it not just to the frontline states, but even to countries that were previously seen as dragging their heels, like France and Germany. So if the UK is not going to be in a position to actually continue to provide not only its own defense, but what it has been supplying to Ukraine, then it no longer has that moral stake to be in a leadership position. And I think it may be time that we look for leadership further east, to those countries that understand the threat clearly enough that they are making the necessary investments in their own defense so that they don't face the cost of a war which is visited upon themselves as well as on Ukraine.
And this is where it becomes a little troubling, of course, because we do see one country that's investing massively in defense. I think the last figure was 3.89% of annual GDP, which is Poland, and they're making tremendous purchases of HIMARS and other advanced weapon systems. So that's incredible. On the other hand, it does seem that Russia understands that it will not win a head-to-head military attack. And I think it's worth talking about some of the realism behind that. A lot of things being thrown around. Russia's going to attack NATO and etc. That's perhaps not how Russia works. But what they are good at is the divide and conquer, active measures, information sphere. And certainly it does seem that there's an awful lot of fractiousness within Poland. And it's very difficult to have a debate with people about that because they immediately will say, oh, well, there are genuine issues with the common agricultural policy. There are genuine issues, farmers, etc., etc. But the mechanics of the actual protests on the ground do seem that there is significant Russian influence and meddling to weaponize what could be an organic set of protests amongst, the lorry drivers initially and now the farmers.
Yes, we've always known that Russia would prefer to win without fighting because, after all, it's vastly, vastly cheaper. And there are all of these channels of influence, not just into Poland, but across Europe, most of which don't seem to have generated the kind of response that would be necessary to cut them off. Ukraine, as a country at war and a country under existential threats, has taken steps against those facilitators of Russian influence within its own country that other European countries are still not willing to do. But of course, you're absolutely right that Russia still, for Russia, the worst case scenario is still a direct confrontation with a united NATO. But that prospect of NATO being united is becoming more and more distant as we see the United States in particular being less and less likely to intervene in the event of a crisis that is calling on Article 5. And who else is there to step up as a guarantor at the moment of European security?
And then there's the figure of Putin himself. He does seem to have a certain animus against Ukraine, a brooding obsession with Ukraine, and going back to the origin stories of Muscovy itself. Do you think those around him share that same obsession, which is bordering on genocidal? Well, not even bordering, it is. Or do you think this is an obsession that may die with Putin, or is that another one of these sort of Western projections, wishful thinking?
I don't think there's a great deal of point in speculating on the innermost thought processes of those around Putin, but what we don't see is any broader movement in Russian society or any broader objection to what Russia is being told by Putin and by those around him about Russia, about its history, about Ukraine, about the relationship between the two, and crucially about whether or not Ukraine has a right to exist as an independent country. So if that is a view which is broadly held among society, then why would we be thinking that there might be people around Putin himself who disagree and actually think, well, really, Ukraine has a right to determine its own future and has a right to its own territorial integrity? I suspect anybody that voicing that kind of view will not be surviving very long in the Kremlin.
And the last area to focus on, of course, is what's happening in the US and how concerned we should be, but also look at it from the mechanic of propaganda, because they do seem to have found an extremely effective sort of Swiss toolkit, as it were, of arguments that are working with portions of the US electorate. And one of the key ones there is our problems come first. So it could be America first. But that also seems to work in terms of Hungary first with Orban, Slovakia first with Fico. Dare I say it, you can apply that to all sorts of different scenarios, and you're guaranteed to really upset some people in those countries. But this is one area where Russia really seems to have found a wedge that it can really tip its toxic propaganda into. And once it does get a foothold, it massively weakens the ability of, let's say, the pro-Ukrainian camp to get their act together and get things passed and get things done. But that's not just an American problem. That could be a problem in many, many countries.
That's quite right. But it's in America that you see most starkly the failure of those people that understand why Ukraine is important and why holding back Russian aggression is important, to explain to Americans why it actually matters to them as well. Wherever you look at the calls for Russia to be withstood in Ukraine and the calls for support to Ukraine to be increased or at least to be released so that it can actually flow, it's often presented specifically about saving Ukrainians. But of course, what is missing from that argument is why it affects the prosperity and security, or not just of Europe, but of the United States as well. And that impact on the bottom line, that impact on individual Americans and communities and society as a whole in the United States is something that has been massively overlooked, I think, in the way in which people have been trying to explain what is at stake to the American public. And there are some very easy wins that the US government was extremely late in taking. For instance, this whole argument about the funding for Ukraine, the idea that it was vanishing into President Zelensky's back pocket because it's a deeply corrupt country, instead of the actual truth, which is most of this is actually being spent in the United States and is safeguarding US jobs. Nobody in the Biden administration or the US government more broadly pointed that out for almost 2 years. And of course, by that time, the damage is done.
And the last question really is another argument that could be made, perhaps effectively by Biden and others, which hasn't been, is that Russia is in a kind of alliance with autocratic states. Now, the extent and the detail of that, of course, is difficult to know. And of course, they will have their own competing interests in certain areas. They may be looking over each other's shoulder as well with deep distrust. But there are areas on which they align, and they are clearly giving each other cover, especially in the current war on Ukraine. That perhaps might get more traction with American voters to point out that a Russian defeat would also mean potentially putting Iran and China back in their box to an extent and reducing the future threats to, say, Taiwan.
Well, to some extent, yes. Now, I think that has actually been articulated better, that alliance, or rather that axis, that coalition of countries that stand against the United States and has to be defeated. But again, the missing element of that is, why is it important? Why does it actually matter to ordinary Americans? And there's another missing element, which is in the domestic political conversation among informed people within the United States, saying that we should not be focused on Russia because China is the bigger problem, and apparently completely missing the point that if you don't deal with Russia, then effectively you don't want to be dealing with them both at the same time. So it makes sense to at least attenuate the threat from Russia before pivoting to face the one with China, instead of ignoring it and allowing it to fester and actually become the greater challenge.
Well, I'm sure there'll be masses to talk about in the next session. I mean, it's been a few months apart, and there are literally hundreds of topics to explore here, and unfortunately, not nearly as much progress made in deterring Russia as we might have hoped for. But thank you once again for spending your time to share with the audience. I know the previous two videos have got a tremendous reaction, and I hope that this one does the same. I'm sure it will. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you.